between Generals Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Grant Monument Association, or GMA, is a nonprofit that was organized during the 1990s as the successor to the group of the same name that originally built and administered Grant's tomb in New York City until it was transferred to the National Park Service. The GMA is dedicated to the preservation of Grant's tomb, which has been closed for most of this year due to the pandemic. But thankfully, we can still further the cause of historical education through online programs like this. Tonight's topic is particularly appropriate because this year marks the 200th anniversary of Sherman's birth in 1820. In March of 1864, as he was on the verge of taking command of the entire Union Army after almost 3 years of civil war, General Grant wrote a letter to General Sherman to assign credit for the promotion. He wrote, "What I want is to express my thanks to you and McPherson," a reference to General James B. McPherson, "as the men to whom, above all others, I feel indebted for whatever I have had of success." Sherman, for his part, would achieve his own level of national and even international fame by the end of that year. The partnership on the battlefield and the personal relationship between the two legendary Civil War leaders is a rich topic. And who better to discuss it than our speakers tonight? Once again, we are honored to have back a military giant of our own time, General David Petraeus, to lead this colloquy. Tonight's guest, Dr. John Marszalek, is the Executive Director and Managing Editor of the Ulysses S. Grant Association. That is the organization that published Grant's papers and now manages the Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State University. Dr. Marszalek's scholarship on the Civil War is extensive. He has written or edited more than 20 books and 300 articles and book reviews. This includes 3 books about Sherman, his completion of the scholarly editions of Grant's papers, and an annotated edition of Grant's memoirs. He is currently editing an annotated edition of Sherman's memoirs. In short, I don't believe there is anyone living with more scholarship under his belt on both Grant and Sherman than Dr. Marszalek. We very much appreciate both of tonight's speakers taking time out of their busy schedules to join us. And with that, I am happy now to turn the program over to General Petraeus. General?
Well, thanks very much, Frank. Thanks for the kind introduction. Thanks for the invitation to return for yet another one of these great events. And thanks most importantly for your wonderful leadership of the Grant Monument Association, the leadership of many years, an association that has done so much to ensure that Grant's resting place is maintained in the standard to which his extraordinary service clearly merits. So thank you for that. And Professor Dr. John, thank you so much for joining us for the conversation this evening, where we can explore that extraordinary relationship that existed between Grant and his most trusted of battlefield commanders, and one that was, again, so enormously close and mutually respectful, where they depended on each other. I say somewhat jokingly that Sherman reportedly stated after the war that he stood by Grant while he was drunk and Grant stood by him while he was crazy. And it was that kind of relationship. And another one of the stories that Sherman told Grant, "I knew that if I called on you, that you would come from wherever you were." And these kinds of, again, episodes, these kinds of statements, and most importantly, the actions and the correspondence between them speaks to that extraordinary relationship. And yet, as you have noted, they were indeed incredibly friendly, but they were also extraordinarily different. Could you explain that a bit, please?
Yes, well, thank you, General. I appreciate your taking the time to do this. I know what a busy individual you are, and I'm honored to be on the program with you. Um, Grant and Sherman were really interesting figures in their own right, I think. Just to look at them, let us say that Grant and Sherman walked into your room or my office or wherever. What would it be like? Well, I think what it would be like was Sherman would start spotting people in the audience and saying, "Oh, there's old Charlie. How you doing?" Slap him on the back, etc. Meanwhile, Grant would take a look at things and find the corner where nobody was sitting, so he could be by himself and nobody would bother him. And then you think of that, and yet they agreed on so many things. The other interesting thing I think about them is Grant is a small man. He's about 5'6". In fact, we have a living statue, or a statue, I should say, at our Grant Presidential Library that shows lifelike what Grant was like when he went to West Point. He was about 5'1" and he weighed maybe 108 pounds, something like that. Sherman, on the other, and then he grew while he was at West Point, of course, but he became 5'7". But Sherman, in the meantime, is a tall fellow. He's about 6 foot, roughly 6 foot tall, and so he represents just the opposite of what Grant is. And yet they were such very close friends. They really liked each other. And I'm going to maybe talk about this later. But one of the main reasons, I think, is that Grant had a great deal of confidence in his own ability, believe it or not. Whereas Sherman was not so sure. And when the war started, he was convinced that the South was going to win. The North was certainly not going to win. And so until he met Grant, and Grant told him and showed him how calm he could be and how well he could maneuver troops. So the result is that by the early part of the war, the two people like each other, and they like what each one represents. And that's that quote that you just cited a while ago about how they didn't worry about each other when they were apart because they knew the other one was thinking of them. And the last part of the statement is, "And I knew you would come if still alive." So I think the very fact that the two people are so close and yet so different says something about the Civil War and says something about what these two people were really like.
It's interesting, in fact, that a former chief of staff of the Army, a great one, General Gordon Sullivan, used to give out, these little knives that the chiefs give out along with coins and other things to people that do great work or what have you. And one of them had on it, it just had engraved Sherman to Grant. And he would then explain what Sherman said about, "I knew that you would come if you were still alive." And he gave that to his very closest of associates. Now, Sherman and Grant, of course, were alike in many, many respects. They wrote memoirs that were very significant, both of these. But clearly, I assume you have a judgment of them, relatively speaking. And I'm just curious which one you see as the most important and the most significant, and why.
Well, that's an excellent question, and I guess I'm a little prejudiced because I and Louis Gallo, who's one of the co-editors, and David Nolan, another one of the co-editors, did the Grant memoirs, and it was a marvelous experience. So we got so excited we decided to do the Sherman memoirs too, which is what we're working now.
The annotated version, you mean?
Yeah, annotated.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, oh yes, exactly. But the result is that we have, and Harvard Press published the Grant memoirs, and it's going to be publishing the Sherman memoirs, which tells you something. I think they don't normally do that. but the situation was so clear to us, at least clear to me, that of the two, Grant has the greater memoirs. And the reason is, if you look at what some of the great writers of that period said about the memoirs, you get a feel how much they respected Grant. In fact, it's sometimes said that Grant has the most important nonfiction book ever written by an American, whereas Herman Melville has the fiction book. And I discovered this the hard way, or we discovered this the hard way, when we started working on the Sherman memoirs. Sherman would mention everybody that he ever met, anytime, whereas Grant was very clean, very even-tempered kind of response. But the situation of Sherman is, Sherman would say, well, yeah, I met so and so. I met this courier who was, and you say, well, who the heck is this courier that he's talking about? But he mentions all of that. So to put it mildly, I would think that the Grant has the greater memoirs. I think they're more interesting. They're more to the point. Sherman writes a chapter about fighting a war, as you may have read, and that's quite good. But some of it is just over repeating things that happen. And secondly, or finally, Sherman always took the position that he knew what was right, what had to be done. And so he never really, in his memoirs, except to Grant, gives credit to some of the soldiers, and McPherson too, but he gives credit to some of those soldiers for what they did not accomplish. And he will say, well, old Charlie, he was fighting here and he really didn't do the job that he should have, because that kept me from doing such and such. So you have a whole different approach to the thing. And so the result is that Sherman's looking at the memoirs is much less insightful, I think, than is Grant.
Well, thank you for that. Since this is the Grant Monument Association, after all, I was hoping that you would reach that conclusion. Yes. Now, you noted that Grant has an important presidential library at Mississippi State University with a huge collection of manuscripts and material there. Sherman has a huge collection all over the nation, but not famous for his manuscripts or anything else, except for he's really famous for Sherman's March to the Sea and the swath of destruction that accompanied that particular maneuver. Why the difference in this case as well?
That's an excellent question. I think the main reason, and I think this is from the experience with the Grant Presidential Library, is that most people react to react to Grant in a much better way than they respond to Sherman, particularly in the South, I think. The mythology of Sherman is very, very powerful, that he destroyed, he had this swath of destruction that he did, etc. Well, Grant never did that. And the interesting thing is that Grant actually killed more people than did Sherman, which is intriguing. But that was something that was always collected. And the point of the matter is he just doesn't write as well. You read his letters, and they're absolutely unbelievable. Some of the stuff that he says, that he talks about, is quite good, very, very insightful. But he could talk to anybody. He could talk to a general like General Petraeus, or he could talk to somebody like me who taught college for a number of years, and he could do this and he could do that. He could talk to the fellow who was the head of agriculture in California, and so on. So you have where Grant wouldn't care one way or another, but yet people like Grant, and they don't like Sherman. I think because Sherman is just so much more willing to speak his mind.
And why the collection of the memoirs? In fact, I should ask, what in the world are Grant's memoirs or his papers and his library doing in the heart of the Deep South at Mississippi State University?
Well, that's an excellent question. This is no joke, but one of the questions I always get when somebody from the media particularly calls and says, that'll be the first 99.9% of the time, that'll be the first question that'll be asked. How is it possible? I think it's possible for a number of reasons. I think the fact that Grant's papers are where they are indicates just how much Mississippi has grown in the last. We have literally not had anyone come to our library, come to our presidential library and say, well, you shouldn't have him. After all, he's just a bum, and et cetera, et cetera. But our president, for example, Mark Keenum, is very much of a Civil War buff. And he loves to talk about the Civil War. In fact, he went out of his way to get us a cannon to have at the front of the library because he thought that would add something. And then Frank Williams, of course, who's the president of the Grant Association, he's a great collector of Lincoln, and he's collected huge amounts of Lincoln. Well, he saw what a good job was being done with the Grant papers, so he donated all his material to Mississippi State, with the idea being that down the line, this is going to help. And Frank says this regularly. Down the line, it's going to be said that the Mississippi State has these papers because the donors wanted the Civil War to be over and to have things happen the way they actually happened. So. And then the Dean of Libraries was another, Frances Coleman, who's now retired, but she was another individual who really wanted it. And we worked hard, and we worked with Southern Illinois University, but we got it. And we're just so thrilled. We have all kinds, like Ron Chernow comes and other people come.
When was it actually established there?
No, it was actually established at Ohio State University.
Sorry. When was the Grant Presidential Library established at Mississippi State?
Well, actually, it's been about 10 years since the Grant Presidential Library came to Mississippi State. But the fact that the state legislature, led by Dr. Keenum, was able to build a new wonderful floor for us. It was only about 2 years ago. And so we believe, as good a collection of Grant material as anybody in the world.
I'm going to jump back and forth between some of the questions that you and I developed and into some of the audience questions that were submitted.
Sure.
This group having a wonderfully inquisitive and informed audience. And the first of those questions asks, was there any record of discussion between the generals of Sherman's April 8, 1863 letter that he filed recording his objections to Grant's plan for the Vicksburg campaign? And for the audience, again, the context for this was that Grant plans this incredibly audacious and quite risky storming of the, going down underneath the guns of Vicksburg on the river and linking up with the troops south of, and then going into the countryside first to defeat in detail the reinforcements that were going to come to Vicksburg, and then and only then turning and investing Vicksburg in a siege. But Sherman, somewhat understandably, looked at this and raised very considerable concerns about the level of risk, so much that he insisted on an official letter being put into the file. But again, was there a record of the discussions between the generals around that letter?
Not around the letter as much as it was. One of the other reasons Sherman talked about this was because of McClernand. You remember McClernand went to his buddy Lincoln and said, I really should lead this expedition. I'll get you the troops. I'll lead the expedition, etc. But it didn't happen. And well, it didn't happen. And McClernand was just simply not a good general. I mean, I hate to say that, but that's true. But in any case, so what Sherman wanted to do, he said, you know, it's a big mistake, Grant. You've tried all sorts of things. For example, the Williams Canal, you know, building this canal, that was never worked out, and other things. But anyway, what Sherman wanted to do is he wanted Grant to pick up all his troops and move back to Memphis, move north, so that he could start all over again. Because as you know, it was a lot of difficulty. But Grant said, wait a minute, if you do that, the American populace is going to go crazy. They're going to think we're falling back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what Sherman did in order to undercut McClernand and also to talk to his friend, Grant. So he did that. But what Grant did, actually, Sherman gave Grant this letter, which is still available. And Grant didn't even look at it. He just shoved it in his pocket, and he decided what he was going to do instead is the famous episode of the boats going down the river past the thing. So, and then later, I think what's even more interesting, later on, some politicians from Illinois came for a visit. And Grant is off to the side and he's hearing this conversation going on. And what they're basically saying is that Sherman, Sherman admitted that Grant had come up with the successful plan, that it was his idea. I told him he shouldn't do it. I told him it was a mistake, but I still think that what he did was right. And we won this battle and he's responsible for it.
And he certainly was.
Yeah.
And of course, that propelled him east, ultimately in command of all of the different forces. Now, Grant and Sherman had interesting families as well, or quite contrasting families. How was each of them aided by his respective families?
Well, yeah, I think you're right. Both of them. Well, Sherman had the more important family.
Yes. Yeah.
Grant's father, who's an intriguing man. I don't know if you've read much of his,
Yes.
but he's not afraid to speak his mind, and he tell you
No.
how important he is. And when Grant gets to be president, he wants Grant to take care of some of his buddies back at home, et cetera, et cetera. But in any case, you have the situation where Grant's father is very outspoken. Sherman's father dies when he's 9 years old, but he goes and lives with his foster father just up the hill in Lancaster, Ohio, and it was one of these things where Thomas Ewing had been a senator at one time, and he was also the first secretary of the Interior. I'll get it out. Was first secretary of the Interior. But the other interesting thing is Mrs. Grant was very quiet, never had much to say. In fact, Grant never says much about her, whereas Mrs. Ewing is very religious, and she tries to make Sherman into a Catholic because she's very much of a Catholic. So she works on on Sherman, and she works on his foster sister, his foster wife, Ellen. And Sherman never becomes a Catholic. In fact, they have to sneak in a priest to give the last rites at the very end. But the point of all this is that both sides had individuals who could help them. Sherman, for example, had tremendous help from his brother, Senator John Sherman. Grant had tremendous help from people like I'm trying to think. I can't think of his name now. But there were several politicians in his hometown that really helped him a great deal. So both of them had families or friends that were there to support them if possible. The thing that's most amazing to me is that Grant wanted to get into the Army and he couldn't because it took finally
Yeah.
the governor of Ohio to give him a more or less of a job. Whereas Grant wanted to go into the Army and finally did, but he went in because of accidents more than anything else.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, again, their personal makeup. Sherman, again, as we alluded to earlier, had what some people call a nervous breakdown along the way. And Grant just kept plugging. In fact, one of Grant's most extraordinary qualities was this indomitable determination, this incredible quiet will. How did all this come about? Of course, occasionally Grant would, again, resort to some drinking, but never on the eve of battle or during battle. Usually, in fact, in the wake of a battle, perhaps considering the terrible loss of life.
Well, that and plus one of the things that I don't know a whole lot about, and there isn't much said about this, but Grant also had migraine headaches. You know, the famous episode when he's supposed to be going to meet Lee, and he's got this headache until Lee says, "Yes, I'm willing
Yes.
to talk to you." So that could be something. But the nervous breakdown, I think this is one of the reasons why Grant and Sherman are friends. Excuse me, because Sherman believed that the North was not doing what it should do to win this war. And so he constantly is saying, we got to do this, we got to do this. When he goes to Louisville, in fact, he doesn't want to go in the Army because he thinks the North is not going to prepare itself for this particular war. So when he's in Kentucky, he really has what we would call a nervous breakdown. It's more depression, I think, than anything. But it meant that both men could look to each other for support, particularly at this time. Grant was out near the front lines. Sherman was in Paducah, Kentucky, doing something to try to get supplies to Grant. And the result is that the two of them begin to say, hey, you know, this guy's not so bad. Well, you know, if I listen to him, maybe I'll learn something. So I think that's indeed part of it. And the intriguing thing is the family of Sherman saves him. I think his wife saves him. She even goes to Washington, D.C. to talk to the president, to talk about what some of the problems that Sherman is having. Grant never even meets Lincoln until he's made commander of all the forces. So it's an intriguing kind of a situation where they almost, maybe going too far, but they almost fall into something, but they sure fall in together, and they come to respect each other, and so they come to work together.
And why was it that Sherman was so willing to be a subordinate of Grant?
I think what I just said, I think, is probably the main reason. I think that Sherman understood and saw in Grant somebody that could help him reach his potential. And I'm sure you have this, except I was in the Army too, but not nearly a general, far from a general. But one of the things that was important, certainly, was to have somebody that you could look to that could give you advice and could help you, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that happened with Sherman is that what happened was that he got to look to Grant as somebody who could preserve him, who could help him, et cetera. Grant looked to Sherman as somebody he could always depend on. Sherman wouldn't knife him in the back. And so the two people almost, again, accidentally almost came together.
Now, what did each of them, who again had, Grant in particular had complicated backgrounds, but Sherman, of course, served or worked in the South later. In fact, he was the first president of, what was it, Louisiana
Military seminary,
state
yes.
seminary of learning and military academy. What did each of them think of Black people?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's another intriguing story. I think that Sherman has no respect for Black people. So, for example, when it comes to serving, having Black troops, for example, Grant is very much in favor of it because Lincoln's in favor, and he knows this. Sherman, on the other hand, doesn't want to have anything to do. In fact, he says this awful thing about that I'd rather, yeah, I could have Black soldiers, but I might just as well have a sandbag because they would do the same, play the same role. And that's just an awful sort of thing to say. But they both felt as time went on, if you read Sherman's memoirs, you still see he's holding back some. Grant is all in favor of Black troops, including his friend, the Seneca Indian from around my hometown of Buffalo, the Seneca Indian, who becomes head of the whole Indian Commission. And he's a Black man, and he's an Indian, but that's the one that Lee said supposedly, well, are you an American or what are you? He thought he was a Black man. And the result was that the man who was the friend of Grant's said, no, I'm an American general. I'm a Native American. And Lee supposedly said, well, it's good to know that we have at least one real American here with us during his surrender terms.
A critical relationship, as the war develops, needless to say, is that between Grant and Lincoln. And, there have been books written, Lincoln finds his general and so forth. But what was the relationship between Lincoln and Grant and also Sherman?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because it takes us back almost to what we started talking about, how the Grant and Sherman are not similar, but they are similar. And one of the major things, I think, is that Sherman had Senator John Sherman as his brother, and consequently, John Sherman is a very important figure to Abraham Lincoln, because he's a leader in the Republican Party, and Lincoln and Sherman actually met through Senator Sherman, and it was at that time that our friend Sherman did not like Lincoln, because he thought Lincoln wasn't paying enough attention to what a big problem he had with the people who were fighting throughout the war. So the big thing, though, I think the most important thing is that the two of them, both Grant and Sherman, just kept winning. They never asked anything of Lincoln. They just kept moving forward, and actually Grant told Lincoln this. He said, "You're not going to ever ask. I'm never going to ask you to give me any more stuff. I have enough. And if I screw up, it's my fault. I'm not going to blame you." And so Lincoln says, "Oh, this is pretty good." And of course Sherman works this pretty much the same way.
Which, of course, is quite in contrast to Sheridan, who never had enough. And as you'll recall, I think Lincoln wrote to him and said, "If you're not going to use your army, perhaps you can loan it to me, and I'll put it to use."
That was McClellan. Yeah, McClellan.
I'm sorry, McClellan. Yeah.
McClellan, yeah.
Yes, yeah, right. That's right. Who had two shots at the commander of Union forces, as I recall. Yes, Sheridan was really the other great general of under Grant, I would say, along with Sherman, certainly. Now, another element in this mix, interestingly, especially in the Western theater, was the U.S. Navy, where Grant used it very effectively at Fort Donelson, the land between the lakes and so forth, and Fort Henry. How did Sherman work with the Navy? Did he have a good relationship with it, the same kind that Grant enjoyed with the commanders of the naval forces?
I think so, yeah, and particularly with Admiral Porter. Admiral Porter was somebody that worked very closely with Sherman. Sherman spent time on board Porter's ships, et cetera. And when it came to Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, actually Fort Henry, that really was won by the Navy, and Sherman understood that. Fort Donelson, of course, was more
Yes.
done. And then Vicksburg, of course, without the Navy, Vicksburg would not have succeeded. And so Sherman knew that he needed the Navy, and he reacted well to the Navy. And I think he liked the Navy people for whatever reason. He never really says, but it's pretty clear that he likes what he sees in the Navy boys.
Well, and of course, they saved Grant and Sherman at Shiloh.
Right.
About which, let me ask a bit about that. Fairly early on, still in the Western campaign, 1862, why was Shiloh so pivotal in the relationship between Grant and Sherman that really seems to flourish really after that particular, very nearly a terrible reverse for the Union forces?
That's right. I think you've already answered your question. In fact, maybe I could ask you to talk about a little bit about this this famous statement that was supposedly said by Grant, and I think it was. But if you would just talk.
Well, as we were talking before this started, at the end of that terrible first day, and of course Shiloh was always called Bloody Shiloh because there was such terrible loss. But at the end of the first day, when Sherman and Grant were nearly driven back into the Tennessee River, they're clinging to the riverbank. It's at night. All of the available shelter is being used by the surgeons to hack off limbs, and you can hear the cries of the wounded still on the battlefield. The Navy, meanwhile, is working very hard to bring in reinforcements, which ultimately will enable the Union to own the field later on. But that night's still a pretty desperate situation. And Grant is sitting under a tree with a stub of a cigar in his mouth, and at least according to some, it's light rain and it's dripping off his slouch hat. And Sherman comes out of the dark and says, "Well, Grant, we had the devil's own day today, didn't we?" And Grant takes a cigar out and replies, "Yep, lick 'em tomorrow, though." And as I mentioned, I actually told that story in a very, very tough day in Baghdad some months into the surge. And it became a bit of shorthand for just hang in there. This is when we need this indomitable determination, fierce determination, but quiet, that Grant always exhibited, unshakable, I think, on the battlefield, and a true feature of Grant. And that's what we needed at various times, particularly in the early months of the surge, which were so very, very tough. And it did become a bit of a watchword or a bit of a phrase that was full of a lot of meaning. And certainly, again, between Grant and Sherman, that was a very formative endeavor.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because one of the things that we sometimes forget is Grant said after the Battle of Shiloh, he said, "I never had to worry about Sherman. I went that early in the morning and I saw what he was doing. He had everything under control, no problem. We'll just go on." So when Sherman visits Grant, when it's already night and the Union troops have really been beaten up something pretty severely. So what Sherman thinks when he says that, he doesn't know what to say, because he says, my friend Grant is really going to be upset about what's happened today. So he makes that statement that that you just mentioned. But he thought that what Grant would say is that, Sherman, what we're going to do tomorrow, we're going to retreat and we're going to start all over again. And Grant says, no, no, no. Instead, he said, we're just going to keep going. So the next day, he moves forward, goes forward, drives the Confederates off the battlefield, and both men come to say, "Holy mackerel! This Grant stuff, he knows his stuff. He's doing a heck of a job here." And so I think that had something to do with it. And after that, Sherman looks at Grant in a not in a different way, but he looks at Grant and he basically says, you know, I thought he was going to retreat, but he doesn't retreat. He just keeps moving forward and forward and forward. And if you look at Grant throughout the Civil War, it's that persistence that you really see. He never stops. He never quits moving forward.
And dogged determination.
Now,
we've asked about their families. We've asked about the relationship with the Navy. What did Grant and Sherman think of their Confederate opponents, like Lee and Johnston and the others along the way?
Well, interestingly enough, some people argue, and well, both really liked Johnston. They thought he was a terrific general. And some people at the time said, yeah, that's because they beat both, he beat both, they beat both of them in that, both Lee and Johnston. My favorite story is Grant talking to some of his soldiers, and he gets really angry. I think one of the few times that Grant becomes angry, and he says, I don't understand all this. You people keep thinking that General Lee is going to do a flip and going to end up behind the lines, and he's going to have all of you people taken care of. He said, that doesn't happen. He said, I know Lee, and I can take care of him. And I know that he can be met and he can be taken care of, which I think is another important thing about Grant, because no one else at that point, everybody else, I should say, at that point, looked at Lee as some sort of Superman. And he wasn't a Superman. He was just, in fact, one of the intriguing things about Lee is that, of course, he has some heart problems. And so he's having difficulties in that latter part of the war, which again is one of the issues. And the fact is that he did, after all, push for slavery, and that's another problem that we don't ever talk about.
Well, it's being talked about more and more, frankly.
Yeah, it is, though,
as we re-examine why it is that federal forts, federal army bases, are named in a number of cases for leaders of forces that fought against federal forces in defense, of course, of their states being able to enslave others. And of course, those others are now 20% of the soldiers serving on those federal forts in general. And I think that issue is one that has actually returned very significantly, and is in fact is in the National Defense Authorization Act that is being wrangled over on Capitol Hill right now. And it'll be interesting to see how that is resolved in the remaining weeks and months of this administration. Now, there was another very important figure, of course, in this, the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Halleck, Brains Halleck, as they call him. And the relationship, again, between Halleck and Grant, and Sherman and Halleck, is significant as well. Tell us a bit about that, please.
Yes, Halleck is an intriguing, very, very much of an intriguing figure. I did a little book about him a while ago, and before I got into it, I was asking several historians what they thought, should I do it or and one of them said, John, you will never finish the biography of Halleck, and the reason is you'll die of boredom first. And so I've often thought of that. I did it anyway, but Halleck wants to be in command, but he doesn't want to command. I think he one of the happiest days of his life are when Lincoln appoints when he appoints somebody else like Grant to do the orders, because Halleck could then say, hey, General Grant says that I should tell you that such and such and such and such is the case. And the famous story of Grant going to visit Halleck, and Halleck doesn't take any of his advice. In fact, basically says, you're stupid, get out, get lost. And then you also have the situation at Shiloh, after Shiloh, at Corinth, where Grant, Halleck basically says to Grant, you be my second in command, but he really means you're just going to be, just get out of the way and I'll take care of things. So anyway, to make a long story short, I think that Halleck understands that he's got to be good to Sherman because Sherman's got the people behind him. Grant, he doesn't like at all. I mean, and he goes out of his way until Grant becomes the commanding general. Then suddenly he's a much more important figure.
By which time, of course, then Halleck is the chief of staff. And Grant uses him to hang out in Washington.
That's right.
While he keeps his headquarters in the field, but does outrank Halleck because he has the 3 stars of a lieutenant general that no one had worn, I guess, since Washington. I think that's that is right. Yeah, but I mean that is the case, but Halleck was so happy not to have to do anything, to give orders to anybody, to tell them to do anything, because he can always blame Grant. It's not my fault. Grant said I should do it. Now, by the time that you end up with Grant as president, and we'll ask a little bit about, actually, in fact, let me ask first how it was, given that Sherman and Grant both famously disliked politicians, hated might not be too harsh a term, yet Grant ran for president twice. What led to that?
That's an excellent question, because that makes absolutely no sense. I know exactly what you're saying. Grant does not like politicians. Sherman hates politicians, despite the fact that his brother is a big time politician. But the whole thing. What was you asked me that question, and I started going another direction.
Well, why did Grant run for president if both of them hated politicians so much?
Right. Yeah, I think it was because Grant had convinced himself that he was the only person in the country at that time who could deal with the real politicians, that he could do what had to be done to preserve the nation. He had, after all, preserved the nation in this first war. And I mean, in the first battles of the first war. Now he's president. Of course, he's going to be the person who's going to continue, because he's afraid if he drops out, everything that was won in the Civil War will be lost. And whether that's true or not, we don't know. But it's certainly something he thought about.
Well, it certainly wasn't headed in a great direction under President Johnson, needless to say. Right. During which Grant, one of the very unsung periods of Grant's career was how he was a bulwark against some of the more misplaced ideas, as you'll recall, of Andrew Johnson, and including going into him to object very, very firmly to certain actions and either preventing them or getting them reversed. And of course, it's accurate, I think, to say that Grant is the man, as one of the books, I guess it was a Brands wrote, Grant saved the man who saved the Union, which of course, I think it's accurate to say that he did, because he ensured that the battles were won in the summer and fall of 1864 that ensured Lincoln won re-election, running, of course, against McClellan, who had said that he would sue for peace with the South if he had been elected. Now,
That's right.
actually, of course, Sherman not only hated politicians, he hated Washington. Remember, let's
That's
fast
right.
forward that when he was chief of staff of the Army, he moved the Army headquarters out to, I think, to Fort out in Kansas, actually
No,
to Fort Leavenworth
actually,
or St.
well, no,
Louis.
St. Louis, St.
Yes, that's what
Louis,
it
yeah.
was. Yeah.
And actually, I mean, he's your thing about Leavenworth is accurate too, because he's the one that believed that soldiers should be professionals, and what better place than Fort Leavenworth to set up professional school for soldiers? So that's good.
Now, both Sherman and Grant had these great overseas travels. Why did Grant's trip have such an enormous impact on the U.S. role in the world, but Sherman's really did not?
That's very true. I think the main reason is, as you know, Grant made the great trip after he was no longer president. So people in Europe and all over the world where he visited were indicating that, hey, this guy is the president of the United States, and he's such a nice guy. I mean, he doesn't seem to hold it over us. I mean, the famous story of Bismarck, where he goes to visit Bismarck, and Bismarck is expecting all these troops to be coming around with him and all, and he just walks over there, knocks on the door, and says, "I'm here to see Mr. Bismarck," and that's not something that you normally would expect from someone like a Grant. But Grant did that, whereas Sherman goes to Europe actually much earlier than that. And the famous story there is where he says, we're going to meet the Pope. And this one soldier says, I don't like the Pope. I'm not going to bow to the Pope. And sure enough, as soon as the Pope walked in, the first guy to get down on his knees was this soldier. But Sherman thought that he was important, certainly, and he was important that the Pope should be thrilled to meet him, and also the whole question of giving him the opportunity to see things that he never saw. I mean, what you have, which is fascinating, is he writes to his wife just about every day about what it's like in Europe, and there's some wonderful stuff. I mean, he just writes long letters, and so eventually somebody's going to do that, and I think that's going to be worth copying some of that stuff, because he just goes on and on and on and on.
Now, in Grant's inaugural address, his first one, he spoke very eloquently about wanting to have a kind and encouraging policy toward the American Indians. It seems, though, that Sherman and others like Sheridan favored a much harsher policy toward the tribes, which they saw as standing in the way of the advancement to the West. Can you speak a bit about what their feelings were toward the Native Americans?
Well, that's one of the excuse me. That's one of the mythologies about Sherman, is that he said the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Well, actually, that was Sheridan who said that, and Sheridan was the one who was out west. Sherman went out west, but he went out because he loved to sit around the campfire with some of his soldiers, telling stories, etc. Whereas the situation was not always that clear, and Sheridan really hated the Indians. Sherman believed that the Indians should be eradicated, not eradicated, but moved out of the way, because all they're doing is they're blocking the way of the white settlers. And if we could just get them out of the way, let the white settlers go, let not have arguments between these two, everything will be wonderful. So Sherman is no Prince of Peace, let us say. Grant, on the other hand, seems to want to do what's right for the American Indian, and so he talks about doing this and doing that. where it isn't the same thing for where Sheridan just literally wants to kill people off, and what they do is the army really cleans out the Native Americans in this particular time.
Very tragic and
it is tragic,
sad episode in our history, needless to say, reprehensible. Now, Sherman, of course, suffered a terrible tragedy during the war, the loss of two of his sons, particularly the older son, Willie. Does he mention this in his memoirs or anywhere that you recall?
I don't remember him saying anything specifically, except that he was crushed, absolutely crushed. And he talks about that in letters home. He said, "I'll never get over this." And he never does, for that matter. Willie is one of these young men who wants to be a soldier. He wants to be like his father. And so his father reacts well to this young man. And he's a member of I think it's the 13th Infantry. And so he marches with the soldiers and he does all these other things. And what happens is he gets a fever of some sort. He goes to see General McPherson, and they lose him, and they find him and they put him on the ship, and suddenly he's not feeling so well. And by the time they get from Vicksburg to Memphis, he's pretty sick, and he dies. And he's very much of a religious individual too. And Sherman never gets over that. His wife never gets over that. There are letters between the two of them that are just so sad. It's just hard to believe. Now, Charlie, the other son who really died at birth, if the truth be told, Sherman was gone. Sherman was on his march to the sea, and Mrs. Sherman, Ellen, was having the baby, and the baby died. So Sherman never saw that child. And interestingly enough, because I guess he never saw him, he just never reacted like he did to Willie. Willie was his favorite, and Willie losing Willie almost killed Sherman.
Now, we mentioned a bit briefly about Grant and drinking, but of course Sherman also drank. How did the two of them handle their liquor, if you will?
Well, the interesting thing, I think, just to talk about, Sherman could drink, and it didn't seem to bother him most of the time. I mean, you don't see any references to Sherman being drunk. You don't see any references to Sherman not doing what he should do. Whereas with Grant, they're constantly saying, "Well, the guy's a drunk, et cetera," which he really wasn't. But the thing I think about Grant, to go back to do Grant first, Grant, most of the stories about Grant being drunk are lost cause stories. Are stories that are written up and talked about after the war. The number of people who see Grant not having all his faculties. But the only time you can really see that, I think, is when Sherman is in California. I mean, Grant is in California, and he reacts to the fact that his wife is not with him, and he's just lonely, and so he drinks, and he has the unfortunate problem of having as his commanding colonel an individual who's I guess the only word you could use is a martinet, who sees the fact that Grant is drinking. But the fact of the matter is, all the soldiers drank at this time. This was just part of the deal, that you were supposed to drink because there was nothing else to do. You put up the flag in the morning, you took it down at night, and in between time you didn't have to do much of anything except be there in case there was a difficulty of some sort. So, and I think too that part of Grant's problems, and I said this before, but I don't know how you can prove it or how you could find this out, but Grant had these migraine headaches, which he did experience. And that we do know for a fact. That is true. Now, whether or not that had an effect on him, whether that was what caused it, But the whole thing is that when he's at Fort Humboldt up in on the Pacific coast, this colonel who he's had problems with before creates some more problems and really says, you got to get lost. You got to get off. So after that, the mythology of Grant always being a drunk is true. Sherman said, yeah, I've seen Grant drink too much, but he's never when he's had to do something. Whenever he's had to do something, he's right there and he can do it. So I think that may be one of those lost cause stories that has been built up more than it really is true.
And of course, Lincoln dismissed that by saying when he was told that Grant drank, he asked him to find out what Grant drank because give it to the other generals.
Give it to the other general, and that is so true. That is true.
Well, we are down, I think, to just the final bit of our hour together, and this has been truly delightful. But let me end by asking a question again about Grant, this being the Grant Monument Association, and ask you to explain something that you have assessed about him, that he was the first modern president in American history, and that there were various factors that lead you to offer that assertion.
Yeah, I was just, but please, finish up.
So please, if you could answer that one, I think it would put a fitting bookend on an evening of discussing Sherman and Grant.
Well, I thank you very much. I do. I think he was the first modern American president, and I think how you can, you could go into a lot of different things, but example is world tour. No president's ever done anything like this up to that point, and even after that was Woodrow Wilson that did something. Julia, his wife, played a major role. She helped fix up the White House because the White House was in big problems, having problems with Grant and Lincoln, rather Lincoln's funeral. One of my favorite things is the fact that he got a speeding ticket. Grant got a speeding ticket. He got stopped by a policeman in Washington, D.C. And he said, "You're going too fast in your carriage, General. But since you're the president, we'll let you go." No, I'm paying. I did that wrong, so I should pay. He was fleeced by a Sharpie, literally fleeced by someone. The Yellowstone National Park, he signed the first of the national parks that this country has had. And I think too, the courageous death he had, that we didn't talk much about his memoirs.
Yeah.
It was awful. I mean, you read some of these things, it literally brings tears to your eyes what that man suffered for. And I think the big thing is that Grant is the most important figure. Once Lincoln is gone, Grant is the most important figure in American history in the late 19th century. But it's also a fact that Sherman loved the theater. And he would go to the theater and he'd go on Wednesday and see the first half and go on Thursday and see the second half because he couldn't stand sitting in one place for that long a time. And finally, he went to every veterans meeting there ever was, I think. So I think all of those things make him, and you could argue some of them I just threw in because I like the story, but I think it is true that he's a modern president. He does things.
Well, and of course, don't forget that he was the first modern president in the sense that he was the first to get the kind of book deal that all presidents have as a rite of passage after leaving the White House.
That's a very good point. Excellent.
Well, John, thank you so much for sharing an hour with the Grant Monument Association this evening. Thanks for giving us the benefit of your knowledge. Congratulations on the many published works you've had so far, and we look forward to seeing your treatment of Sherman's annotated memoirs as well. Thank you again so much.
Well, thank you for taking the time. This has been an honor to be on. Not everybody can say they were on a program with General Petraeus, so I appreciate this very much.
My privilege. Thank you. And thank you all for being part of this tonight. And thank you most of all for your continued support of the Grant Monument Association. And with that,